process of treatment, but can you tell me a little bit about when you started to really practicing the solution-focused model in your profession and how you discovered it then personally, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, in my role as a family therapist on that adolescent treatment unit, that's where I would start to play around with the ideas and start using some of the questions. I like working pretty independently, and I had a supervisor at that time, since I was the only family therapist, that she would give me a lot of freedom. And no one ever sat in my sessions with me. I don't think anyone really knew what I was doing in the therapy room with my families. The approach at that point that really fit the best was structural family therapy. So I was doing more structural kind of things. I would do genograms. I was also playing around with motivational interviewing kind of concepts when I was working with the kids. And when I was introduced to solution-focused brief therapy, I added that to what I was doing, and I would play around with the ideas, but there really wasn't anybody in the workplace that was interested in what I was doing, or quite frankly even cared, I don't think. So oftentimes I would throw in a scale, maybe throw in the miracle question, and I would get stuck. And when I got stuck, I went back to my structural kind of interventions or motivational interviewing. But on my way home each night, because I had about an hour commute, and I would ask myself, on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 was that I was the type of therapist I wanted to be, and Sue would be proud of how I interacted with my clients, and I would be able to stay in the solution-focused model. That was my 10. And 1, it was just a complete mess that I just walked out in the middle of session, got in my car, and went home and quit my job. It was just that bad. And I would ask myself, so how did I do today? And I would think about my sessions, and I would rate them, and I would, if I said a 3, I would say, okay, so why a 3 and not lower? What did I do? Well, lets me know that it went well. And what would my clients say if I could ask them? And I would just mainly, quite frankly, play with the concepts on myself, because I knew I couldn't mess anything up, and I could easily identify really bad questions and really helpful questions. And so every night, that's what I did on my way home. And then I would also ask myself, suppose you were a little higher on the scale next time you scaled yourself with this client. And I would picture it, and I would say to myself, how did you do that? What did they see in you? How did you handle the teenager's attitude? How did you handle when the parent didn't show up? Or how would you have handled it if the parent said something very rude in front of the child, of like, I wish you'd never been born? How would I have said it in a way that was helpful? And I would just ask myself these questions. And then the next day when I'd show up to work, I would just do my best again. And I did this for a long time. And then eventually I saw a job opening for a supervisor of a dual diagnosis outpatient drug and alcohol treatment center. And I thought, no, I've got to make more money than I am now. And the only way to make more money in the United States at that time was to become a supervisor. So I decided, well, why not apply? Surely they won't hire me. And it turns out they did hire me, even though I had never been a supervisor. And, one of the pieces of advice Insu used to always say to me was, just say yes and panic later. And I've lived my entire career on that advice. And so I took the job and then panicked, thinking, I don't know how to be a supervisor. And then I decided, why not just use the same principles I was using on my clients? I mean, in solution-focused work, you're not pathologizing. You're not looking for people's faults. Why not just use it on average people like my employees? What harm could it do? I didn't know how to be a supervisor anyway. And so I just started trying it. And when I took the job, I started asking my staff the same kind of questions of, suppose that I was a really good supervisor. What would you see in me? What would I have done? How would I have supported your work? what would the clients see in them as employees that made them think, wow, something's different about this program. Maybe they got a new supervisor. How would this trickle down? And I would just ask them these crazy questions. And they would roll their eyes and say, that's a stupid question. And I'm like, yeah, it probably is a stupid question. Suppose I asked a better one. What would it be? And I just did those kinds of things. And that's how I learned this model. But I didn't tell anybody I was doing this. By this point, it was in the 90s, early 90s. And, motivational interviewing was all the buzz. And in fact, in my interview, when people would ask me what my theoretical orientation was during the interview for the job, I quickly said motivational interviewing because that's the only way to get hired. And I never mentioned solution-focused work.
Oh, okay. So that was the way to say something that they were familiar with and that was close enough so you could continue developing your ideas in the yeah, okay.
Yeah. And in that job, I would use motivational interviewing and I would use solution-focused therapy, but I wouldn't call it solution-focused therapy. Steve used to always say to practice in secret and to be careful and not to tell anybody. And I trusted his wisdom. I didn't really understand why he was saying that, but I trusted his wisdom. So I always called it motivational interviewing. But I knew it was different because in motivational interviewing, I was still trying to manipulate the client to see something like the professionals. But in solution-focused work, I wasn't. And so in my role as the supervisor there, I would use solution-focused ideas and questions on my staff, but I would actually help them to use motivational interviewing at that time. But eventually, I'll never forget there was one employee I was working with, and I had all of my staff videotape sessions so I could see what they were doing. And this one employee did this beautiful session about the dysfunctional family. And she had gone on to explain, what the enabler was and the hero and the clown and all of these roles. And in the videotape, there was one client that was completely disengaged, and he was slumped down in his chair, had his arms crossed in a very defiant way. And at one point in her presentation, he looked right at her and he said, "That's not my damn family." And she just ignored him. And he just went back to being disengaged. And so when I was going over the session with this employee, she really had done a really good job. And at the end, she was asking for my feedback. And I said, I'm just curious about that client over there. Who was his family? What did he mean by that? She's like, I don't know. He was being disruptive. And I'm like, yeah, but I just wonder, who was his family? And what I learned later was my staff would take these questions that they couldn't answer, and they were so frustrated by my questions, I later learned. And she went and found all about who his family was, just so she could come back and answer my questions. But that was how I introduced solution-focused therapy, just through genuine questions, being curious about the pieces that didn't make sense.
So she went back and asked him the question you were asking?
She did. Because this was a regular client of hers.
Yeah.
And she knew I wasn't going to give up on. I wanted to know about this man's family. Clearly, he didn't have an enabler and a scapegoat and all these roles she had described. But I wanted to know about that man. And so, she went back and she asked him all about his family. And I think she came back more with the attitude of, fine, I got your answer. But of course, I only had more questions about, well, in this future place, how does he want his family to be? And what role would alcohol play and drugs? And what does he love about his family? Why does he keep them? So many of our other clients would just disassociate from their family, but this man wanted his. And so my staff would eventually start asking these questions, and they would say that my voice would get into their head when they were working with clients, and they could almost predict what kind of questions I would ask them during supervision. And they hated not knowing. The idea of not knowing was so uncomfortable. And I wasn't trying to make them uncomfortable. I knew what the traditional way wasn't going to work. So eventually they started asking me where I came up with all these questions. So I would eventually start telling them. There was another time with that same employee that I don't even remember what all I was asking, but I was watching a videotape with her and I said something about, what worked here? And she's like, well, clearly nothing. And I'm like, oh, how did you keep it from getting worse? And she was getting so mad at me. And she finally said, well, fine. What would you have done? And I'm like, well, now that you ask, I think I would ask the miracle question. And I went into it and she's like, well, that's just stupid. And I'm like, well, maybe it is. I don't know. It probably won't work. And so, of course, she went and asked the miracle question just to prove it wouldn't work. And she came back and she was really mad then because it worked. And she, was wondering what on earth was with this question and why did it work? And so I started teaching my staff about the miracle question and scales. And they started asking what I would do with this or that. And I would tell them and they'd say, well, that would never work. I'm like, yeah, well, maybe not. And they would try it. And so that's how this program got introduced to solution-focused brief therapy. And that's how I actually got my start, was just trying things. But I actually practiced much more on my staff than I did with clients initially, because I was afraid to do harm with clients. But my staff, it was very clear that it was making them think differently. It was irritating them because I wasn't just nodding and going along with what they were doing, but it made them think.
Seems like they were also wanting to keep you happy, and and they heard your questions in their head, so that it can't have been so bad for them, I don't think.
Yes, they would tell me years later about how frustrated they were because they hid it very well. But after their day with clients, I would go up to their offices and I would stand in their doorway and I would just sort of lean against the door jamb and I would ask them about what worked today. And I was actually asking just because as a supervisor, oftentimes we're so separated from our staff. And I loved clinical stuff. I loved clients and I really wanted to know. And so I would just ask them all. And so eventually, about a half hour before the day was done, they would all sort of show up in my office. And one of them even said, we know you're going to show up anyway, so we decided just to come to you. I'm like, okay. And it became sort of a daily ritual of the last half hour before we went home. I would ask them about what worked and how did group go and what would your clients say. And it became a very energizing way for all of us to explore cases in a different way.
Did the result change in any way from the treatment program, would you say, when you changed
Very
the
much
model?
so. People didn't get burned out as quickly. People were energized. It was very common for people to work long shifts in that program because we were open 12 hours most days. And so oftentimes people would work a 10-hour shift, and I would find that people were more energized at the end of the day than they were at the beginning. They were physically tired, but they were very excited about the work. That was very different. They didn't dread the clients as much. I mean, these were really, really tough clients. This was a government county-based program, which meant we could never turn away anybody due to inability to pay. And at that time, the other treatment programs were being very selective about their clients. So the residential programs would kick clients out of treatment for using drugs and alcohol, which never made sense to me. It's sort of like if your car gets kicked out of the mechanic shop because it's not running right. It just made no sense to me. So we would take them into our program simply because it was either that or they could have no treatment.
Mhm.
And so we had clients that needed residential treatment but couldn't get in, so we would take them. And the mental health centers at that point wouldn't take clients that had been using drugs or alcohol. And unless they could prove they had been clean for 30 days, they couldn't go to the mental health centers. So we had clients that really needed psychotropic medication, were delusional or psychotic. We had clients with personality disorders and just really, really tough clients. And we would take them in. And we really had clients that were not at the right level of care. But I didn't know what else to do. So we would use solution-focused principles. And it was sort of ironic, though, because we didn't pay well. We didn't have to have licensed staff. So we got some of the most green staff and professionals right out of grad school. And they were so energetic and full of hope and believing in clients. And I would hire them because of that, because that was such a good fit in solution-focused work.
Mhm.
And they didn't know that this shouldn't work with clients. There was no research showing it worked at that point. But we quickly realized it did work. It worked with some of the toughest clients.
Mm.
You know, when clients would come in intoxicated, we didn't just kick them out. We would still meet with them. We didn't put them in group, of course, but I would say to my staff, they have a reason for coming. We still should meet with them, you know, talk with them as long as they want to stay and talk, and then worry about getting them home safely. And so we were able to work with clients that other professionals wouldn't,
Mm.
or in the history of our program, they would have been turned away.
Mm.
So I think we made a huge difference,
Mm.
you know? And we put in a one-way mirror. And so we started that tradition of I would sit behind the mirror and watch some of the groups, and my team would sit behind the mirror with us. And the shift in the clients was amazing because these were clients that the majority of them were involved with child welfare, probation, or diversion, and were angry and grumpy clients. And yet, when you watch them behind the mirror when we were using solution-focused therapy, you oftentimes couldn't tell who were the ones that had the personality disorders. And you just couldn't tell. They looked motivated. In fact, one time I had some professionals that I can't even remember what country they were from, but it was common that people would contact us and say, we heard you were using solution-focused brief therapy. We want to sit behind the mirror and be able to observe your work. And so I would get the client's permission and the staff's permission, and they would come. And one time, this group of professionals, I could tell were getting angrier and angrier behind the mirror, and I was baffled by it. And so at break, I said to them, you know, what is wrong? And they said, you lied to us. You said these were difficult clients, that these were some of the most challenging. And you have brought us easy clients. You have brought us motivated clients. And I laughed. I know it was inappropriate to laugh, but I couldn't help myself.
Mm.
And I simply said to them, if you ask one wrong question, you will see how difficult these clients are. They're only motivated and appear to be simple because we're using solution-focused brief therapy, you know, and we care about their opinion. If you ask them one wrong question, you will see the clients I described.
Mm.
But that's just sort of a summary of what we saw. Completely different clients.